place where empires go to die. Mike Malloy said this about Afghanistan, and there are plenty of examples to make his point. The British Empire at its height in the late 19th century suffered a genuinely smashing debacle of a defeat at the Khyber Pass, and it really could never come to grips with the country itself. The Russians in the late 20th century made fools of themselves trying to conquer Afghanistan. They tried to overawe and outgun the natives only to be repeatedly humiliated and sent packing. Learning nothing from the failure of these enormous superpowers, the United States in the early 21st century found itself in the same jagged mountains and dusty countryside as we all are very familiar with now. Going on 20 years of fighting, thousands of U.S. personnel have died, countless injured or forever altered, and trillions in treasure has been spent. The cost to the native peoples of Afghanistan can never be fully tabulated. All this has created what General Petraeus termed a, quote, generational struggle, end quote. And it's not our first go around this particular dance floor. Not even close. I can't think of a place more different in appearance from Afghanistan than Vietnam, but the thickly jungled Southeast Asian country has just as much claim to be a graveyard for empires as anywhere else. The Mongols, perhaps the greatest conquerors of all time, had a rough go in Vietnam. Various Chinese dynasties had made plays at controlling their southern neighbor with varying degrees of success, but ultimately they could never quite conquer the country. Then the French tried to stake a claim, but at Dien Bien Phu it became abundantly clear that continued colonial rule just wasn't going to happen. As late as the 1980s, the Red Chinese government made a play, sending tanks and armor over their shared border. Again, the Vietnamese sent them packing. And of course, there was that whole 20-year quagmire known in the West as the Vietnam War. A futile fight to pen in the spread of communism, the Vietnam War saw the United States go from humiliation to humiliation. Even though it was one of two superpowers at the time, and Vietnam was a far, far, far weaker opponent on paper. Of course, on paper is the key phrase there. By the war's end, over 50,000 U.S. soldiers had died, maybe as many as 1 million Vietnamese had died, and those numbers are up for debate and always changing. The war also broke the country's trust in its generals and military leaders. General Dwight Eisenhower, affectionately known as Ike, left a presence, a sense that generals were full of integrity and that the people could believe what generals in the military had to say. Of course, then came Vietnam, and false hope and out-and-out lies of progress, footholds, victory is close by, an end is in sight, the end of the tunnel's here. All these things came flooding from the top brass to the rightfully skeptical press and eventually found their way into the newspapers and television screens of every American. Even more damning was, for the first time, the public got to peek into the mad, mad world of fighting an angry, insurgent-riddled native population on their nightly news. It's out of these dark, steamy Vietnamese jungles that comes the insane line, quote, "It became necessary to destroy the town to save it," end quote. The chaos inherent in that kind of thinking, though, is by no means unique to the Vietnam War or the latter half of the 20th century. There is another place where empires have gone to die and where military minds were at a loss for how to win. In this place, a decades-long struggle would kill and maim thousands, produce 88 Medal of Honor-worthy tales, see 5 future Army Chiefs of Staff, and have many of the famous names from World War I and World War II see time in the fighting line. Today, this war is mostly forgotten. A quick Google search produces only a handful of books to be had on the whole conflict. Compare that to 10,000 and more for both the wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan, and it tells you how little we actually look back and think about what was happening at this time. This hellish place generated the same kind of deadly madness as those other wars, and it was just as violent. One U.S. official prophesied the paradoxical reasoning of the Vietnam-era quote about destroying villages by saying of his punitive and brutal pacification methods, quote, "While these methods may appear harsh, it is the kindest thing to do." This time on Cauldron, let's go back to the island of Jolo in the Southern Philippines. Let's go back to the humid, sticky air of March 1906. To a mountain that sat among the clouds, a volcanic rock with cliffs so sheer a man had to crawl to climb. Let's go back to the crater where hundreds of native Moros, men, women, and children, awaited their deaths. To the crater crest where Krag carrying modern U.S. infantrymen prepared to punish the desperate sword-wielding natives with terminal violence. Let's go back to March 5th through the 8th, 1906, and the Battle of Bud Dajo, also known as the Moro Crater Massacre.